Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is fasting, vegetarianism, and psi. My guest is Michael Daw, who is a postgraduate researcher at the University of Northampton in England with a lifelong interest in parapsychology. His first degree is in social science, and he has a master's degree in computation. He is currently trustee of a local environmental charity focused on action on climate change and increasing biodiversity. He's also worked as a mathematics teacher, software engineer, a senior manager in higher education, and has supported academic research at 3 of the UK's largest universities. Michael is based in the UK, of course, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Michael. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you, Jeffrey, and thank you so much for inviting me on. It's such an honour to be among all the esteemed guests that you've had in the past. So thanks. It's a pleasure to meet you too.
Likewise, and I think it's very exciting that you're able to do a study, as you are, on fasting, vegetarianism, and psychic functioning at a place like the University of Northampton. There are very few opportunities, comparatively speaking, in the United States.
As I think you know, my supervisors, Chris Rowe and Callum Cooper, both of whom have been on your show, no, they're great, really supportive, and very open to new ideas, really, like this idea that I brought them just over 2 years ago. So it's good. It's good to be working with them, and it's good to be working with the setup that they've got down at Northampton as well.
Well, I'm very interested in diet for just as a topic in and of itself, but I've also engaged in fasting. When I was younger, at one point I went on a 21-day fast, and my intuition is that fasting and proper diet does help open one's, let's say, sensitivities.
Yeah, that's my intuition as well. I mean, I have to say, I'm both a vegan and I fast as well. I'm not sure that I've noticed much difference in my own, intuition or psychic abilities, but then I guess that might be down to other factors. I mean, it clearly isn't, it isn't sufficient that you just start fasting and you turn vegan and suddenly you're a super psychic. I mean, I think the best we could hope for is that it's an improvement, really, that it helps development in both, the psychic faculties and spiritual faculties as well.
Well, I think the folklore is something along the lines that when you eat meat, let's start there, that you're getting the hormones from the animal that was killed. Often it's very frightened right before it's executed, so there's fear hormones in the meat that you're eating, and that people who eat a lot of meat are going to have more aggressiveness and more fear and just sort of more animal emotions as a result.
Yeah, and I think from my reading, I think that viewpoint has perhaps mostly come from the theosophical movement. So Helena Blavatsky, who's, as you probably know, is one of the co-founders of Theosophy, she felt that meat kind of clogged the body and mind, and she kind of recommended for students of the occult, as she called it, to avoid meat. And Annie Besant, who was the kind of protege in Theosophy, she also recommended similar, really, for similar reasons. She felt that the fear and suffering that the animal felt kind of polluted the astral plane. She tells a great story, actually, when she was going into Chicago, where she said there were a lot of slaughterhouses, apparently around about, the sort of late Victorian times. she said she could feel it in her kind of astral senses that there was a kind of very dark feeling to the place because of that very thing and these sort of subtle qualities. I have to say, I think my first study, which I guess we're going to talk about, but the first study was I interviewed 7 professional psychics. And actually, while some of them mentioned that as a factor, these sort of subtle qualities of meat, they mentioned other things as well, like health and possible effects on the gut and so on. So I think that is a viewpoint, but it's one of many, and one that I hope we'll be able to kind of test at some point. The sort of, if we can find that there is really an effect, I have to say, because this research is really quite preliminary at the moment.
Well, I know that you have encountered Uri Geller, and that he is one of the world's most prominent psychics. I knew Uri, as a matter of fact, when his career first began in the early 1970s. I've been following his career now for half a century. I consider him very legitimate, although I know every time I mention his name, I hear people who bring up their various silly arguments as to why they believe he's some kind of a fraud. And for all I can't speak for everything he does, particularly when he's on stage, but there's mountains of studies with Uri in the laboratory. The point I want to make, of course, is that Uri himself is a vegetarian and a strong advocate of fasting, and maintains very clearly that his psychic abilities have been improved as a result.
Yeah, well, he's actually vegan. He's kind of quite a prominent vegan. He as you know, he posts a lot on social media, and he posts quite a lot sometimes about his vegan background. When it was great to speak to him. I mean, this is one of the joys of having Cal Cooper as your supervisor, because he seems to have everyone, all sorts of people in his contact list. So he got in touch with Uri for me, and it was good to speak with him. I didn't speak with him for very long. He thought it definitely made a difference, being vegan, to his psychic abilities. Although that's not really the reason why he went vegan originally. He said he didn't want to contribute to the slaughter of animals. He's a great animal lover, is Uri. But he felt, what he said to me was that he thought it was to do with overall health, really. I mean, a vegan diet has been shown by a number of studies to be a very healthy diet, more healthy than eating meat and dairy. And he felt that because the overall health benefits that you get from being a vegan, that actually improved his psychic abilities as well.
Well, I have talked to people who have gone on the vegan diet and found that they couldn't maintain it, that, in fact, that there were adverse health consequences. I think they weren't getting enough protein in their diet, or I imagine that was the problem. Have you found that to be the case with some people?
I think occasionally people are not able to tolerate a vegan diet, but I think that's pretty rare, actually. And I think protein is also rarely a problem, to be honest. I think, there's protein in everything. There's protein in all plants. And if you have a balanced diet, and if you have a good diet, then there's protein certainly isn't a problem. I take supplements. I think you definitely do need to supplement, but then so do meat and dairy eaters as well, actually. I mean, we all need more B12 and omega, for example. And I think increasingly for health reasons, and indeed for the environment, I think it's important that people eat less meat and dairy, and possibly even go vegan. I think what's interesting about the research that I'm doing, if it bears out, then there's possibly another reason for going vegan, if it supports spiritual development and improves our connection, if you like, with that other plane, the sort of more spiritual plane. That's really interesting to me, and that's really intriguing. Of course, it could also be. There's always a possibility that it's the other way around. I mean, if there is a relationship between eating meat and dairy and being psychic, then perhaps it goes the other way. Perhaps people have an increased connection, if you like, an increased connectivity with psi. And perhaps that's what makes them develop a sort of more ethical stance. I mean, who knows? We're at early stages here, but it's possible.
How long have you been a vegan?
I've been vegan for about the past 6 years. I was vegetarian before that. And before that, like most people, I ate meat and dairy. And I didn't go vegan particularly for these reasons, for spiritual reasons or anything. It was just actually mostly environmental reasons because of the large carbon footprint that comes from eating meat. So that was my priority, really. But what happened was, I mean, if I maybe just explain why I got into this research. I mean, I met a guy called Graham Nichols, who teaches out-of-body experiences, and he's written a couple of really good books.
We've recently interviewed Graham Nichols.
Brilliant. No, that's really good. Because I got to know Graham I wanted to induce out-of-body experiences for myself, unsuccessfully, I have to add. But Graham is a great advocate for veganism, and he thinks it improves people's capacity for out-of-body experiences. And actually, when I was thinking about doing, because I've been really interested in parapsychology since I was a child, and I was thinking of doing a PhD, but didn't really know what to do it in. And I read a blog by Graham at around this time, and he did an informal study with some of his students. So he mentions to his students, he suggests that they go vegan in order to support their out-of-body experiences. And then he took a note of how it was really after they went vegan. And he found that the students actually reported quite a significant effect, that they were able to have OBEs more often and sustain them for longer when they went vegan. And I think it surprised even him. Anyway, I read that blog and I thought, hey, this is interesting. Seems to kind of support what a lot of maybe religious and spiritual traditions have been talking about for thousands of years. And so I talked to Graham because I went on one of his workshops and I said, look, I'm thinking of doing a PhD in this. And he said, yeah, that's great. Go for it. So he's been really supportive. He was also one of my participants on one of my studies.
Let's talk about the thousands of years of tradition related to the fasting, vegetarianism, and the vegan diet.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, there's quite a lot there, really. So I think you go right back to, shamanism, which is probably humanity's oldest sustained spiritual tradition with a history going back tens of thousands of years. So shamans fast when they do their initiation. So they have a vision quest. And typically this is accompanied by quite extreme fasting. And they'll also abstain from meat, by the way, as well, typically. But they'll also fast if they want to manifest this sort of trance state that they get into, if they want to do things like control the weather or perform healing. Of course, it's not the only thing they do. I mean, shamans they might take psychedelics or use drumming or chanting, but fasting is definitely in there, an important aspect. But then, of course, you look at the yogic traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and the whole yogic tradition. Of course, you've got the siddhis in that tradition, which are sort of supernormal powers, which are many of them indistinguishable from psi. And many yogis will typically be strict vegetarians and will also fast. And there's also, as you probably know, there's a great tradition in those traditions of vegetarianism, and a lot of people fast in those traditions as well. And then you get onto the sort of Abrahamic traditions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam. In the Bible, right at the start of the Bible, at the very start of Genesis, God is talking to Adam and Eve about their diet, really saying what food he's offering them, and it's all vegan food. It's only after the fall, when they're expelled from the Garden of Eden, that they then start eating meat. And of course, in Islam, fasting is very important, one of their 5 pillars. And there's a beautiful poem by Rumi, the Sufi poet, all about fasting, talking about how when we fast, it's like tuning a musical instrument, and our there's a much purer song comes from us if we're fasting. And even he talks about being able to write secrets when we're fasting. And I'm not quite sure what he's referring to, but maybe he's referring to psi there. And then you get the ancient Greeks as well, who, Pythagoras, before the word vegetarian was coined, it used to be called a Pythagorean diet, if you abstain from meat. And Pythagoras was well known for performing various supernormal powers like walking on water and knowing the future and so on. And there are other Greek mystics who followed similar sort of vegan diets and had these supposed supernormal powers too. So that's just a few examples.
Well, they seem like very good examples. There's clearly a tradition that associates fasting and attention to diet with mystical openings. I don't know that that would be the same as psi, but it's certainly close.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, there are these connections, and let's call it an association, but a lot of the literature, it's kind of circumstantial, if you like, rather than direct. I think we have to kind of move into the 19th century where we get a bit more sort of directive, like I mentioned, theosophy, the theosophical movement, where they're actually advising students of theosophy to stop eating meat in order to improve their powers. I think things become a bit more definite then. But if we're talking about the ancient religions, then I think it is, to be fair, it is kind of circumstantial evidence, if you like.
Well, you described your turn towards a vegan diet as not really being ethically motivated, but you were concerned about the environment, which to me is a form of ethical motivation. And I know that a number of esoteric traditions talk about ethics as being very important when opening up to psychic functioning. So it would seem to me that on those grounds alone, there's a good reason to suspect that a vegan diet will be helpful.
I mean, the environment was the first reason that I kind of had my primary motivation, but ethics was definitely in there. And it's funny, being vegan, you kind of become more aware of the suffering of animals particularly in intensive farming, but all kinds of animal agriculture, and perhaps it does kind of increase one's kind of connectivity and empathy, because it that side of things has definitely become more important to me. My first study was interviewing professional psychics, if you will, and this is when I interviewed Uri Geller and Graham Nichols and a number of other psychics as well. And a lot of those all talked about how important ethics was to what they did. They didn't necessarily ascribe that to improving their psychic performance, if you like. They had other explanations for that. But they all thought that was an important element of being vegan or vegetarian.
Well, here's why I think ethics has a direct effect on psychic functioning. First of all, we all have native psychic talent. It's embedded in every individual. But for most people, the problem about being psychic means that you're going to open yourself up to the pain of the world. There is enormous suffering out there, both human suffering and animal suffering. And I think that for the most part, people insulate themselves against it. You don't want to have to experience that kind of suffering. So we create a thick wall, an invisible membrane that closes off our psychic functioning so that we don't have to feel the pain of other people. But when you begin to say, I'm going to go on a vegetarian or a vegan diet, or I'm going to fast, or I don't want to contribute to the needless death of animals, for example, it means you're beginning to develop a sensitivity to some of the suffering that's out there. And for me, that's the beginning of opening up to psychic functioning.
That might well be the case, yeah. I need to mention as well, one of the people who, there's not been much research done into this area of diet and psi, which is quite nice for me, because it feels like I'm kind of a pioneer in this area. But there was a piece of doctoral research done in the 1990s by Alzak Amlani, and he had a small group of people really who transitioned from eating meat to being a raw food vegan. And certainly his participants said that when they went vegan, they had it kind of, they were far more empathetic, felt far more sort of interconnectedness with plants and animals and Gaia, if you will. So I think I think the two, it's a sort of gut instinct as well. The two are very much related.
Well, let's talk more about your own research.
Yeah. So I've done 2 studies so far. I'm going to do a third. I'll talk about that in a minute. But the first study was I interviewed 7 professional psychics. So as well as Uri Geller and Graham Nichols, there were also mediums and channelers as part of that. And they all used fasting and were either vegan or vegetarian. So I really talked to them about what they did, how they felt that whether they felt that those practices supported what they did. And they felt it very much did. So, for example, Ross Bartlett, who's a medium, he says that he can't eat. He makes a point of not eating some time before he gives a spiritualist reading, because he just says that eating before then, it would just interfere with it. Another participant, Jess Taylor, she says that when she wants to sort of perform some psychic act or whatever she's doing, some psychic task, some channeling or whatever, she feels like fasting is like a kind of sharpening. And actually, Jess is pretty interesting because what she said was she thinks it's all about the gut. She actually thinks the psychic mechanism is in the gut, which is kind of interesting, especially when you think about the phrase that having a gut feeling. And she thinks that psi is caused by certain neurochemicals, and having an empty stomach, a bit like if you drink on an empty stomach, the alcohol will take effect much more quickly. She thinks if you're fasting, then the neurochemicals that can support psi, they'll also take effect much more quickly. So that's a pretty interesting theory. And so that's how they use fasting typically. In terms of the sort of veganism, vegetarianism, they again, Ross, when he went vegan after being vegetarian, he said he had what he called a 30 to 35% increase in his psychic functioning, which is pretty dramatic. Actually, it's more dramatic than I expected people to report. So they all those participants really talked about how veganism, fasting, they were all really supportive of what they were trying to do. Although I have to say, I selected those participants because they fasted and because they were vegetarian or vegan, because I wanted to find out really how they used these practices in what they did and what they thought was going on, really to sort of build a sort of background for the rest of my research. So that was really my first study. Oh, they also talked about, interestingly, they all, as well as being vegan, vegetarian, they all said having a whole food diet was quite important as well. So it's not just a matter of giving up meat and dairy, but it is about having a good balanced diet that's full of nutritious food, particularly green leafy foods as well. So this was all really useful background to my second study, so instead of talking to people who are adept psychics, if you like, I really wanted to find out whether there was anything going on with people who just use those dietary practices, but who are not necessarily adept at psi. So I put together a survey, and I circulated it. I did 2 surveys really. They asked the same questions, but 2 samples. One of those samples was of people who fasted, and the other sample was people who are vegan or vegetarian. Now, I found those people via Facebook groups, and I got almost 1,000 responses in total, which is pretty good. And I asked them, as well as asking them questions about their diet and whether they fasted and how they fasted and so on. I also asked them about their paranormal experiences and abilities and mystical experiences as well. And I mean, I have to say, I didn't know whether I'd come out with any statistically significant results at all. I mean, who knows? These are just sort of regular people who nevertheless follow these dietary practices. But amazingly enough, there are statistically significant associations. So, for example, people who fast in my study report having more psychic experiences and abilities than people who don't fast. Equally, people who fast longer report more experiences and abilities than people who fast for shorter times. In terms of meat and dairy, again, the same association. So people who don't eat meat report a lot more paranormal experiences and abilities than those who do eat meat, and vegans report more than vegetarians, and so on. And even in whole foods as well, people who have more whole foods report more psychic experiences and abilities than those who don't. So it was I have to say, I was a little bit surprised, really, because when you put out this survey, you don't really know what the results are going to be, and you do the analysis, and I was doing the analysis, and indeed it was coming out that people who were reporting these particular dietary practices, are having more self-reported experiences than those who don't. So it's sort of pretty exciting, I think, actually.
What I wonder here, and I imagine you haven't really looked into it, is what about people who are on a very strict diet of a religious nature, like a Jewish kosher diet, which includes meat, but all of the meat has to be killed and prepared in a certain way with blessings and a rabbinical oversight and so on. It would seem to me that it's quite possible that religious Jews or religious Muslims who follow strict dietary practices that do include meat might also report greater number of psychic experiences.
It needs the research to be done, basically. But as you know, research takes quite a long time. So the focus of my research is on fasting and vegetarianism. But once my PhD is finished, I'd like to, there will be far more research to be done. There's lots of different research questions that need to be asked, such as the ones that you're asking. And it's interesting you mentioned about blessing food as well, because Dean Radin actually did a study in the 2000s where he got two sets of chocolate, one that was blessed by monks, or at least by meditators, and one that was a kind of a placebo chocolate that hadn't been blessed at all. And then he did a randomized control trial and found that the people who had the chocolate that was blessed had more of a mood enhancing effect than the chocolate that hadn't been blessed, which is pretty interesting in itself. I mean, that's related to diet, and it's related to blessing. And I think all these things may all be related, really. But I think the fact that diet and what we eat has an effect on psychic abilities is when you think about it, it's not that surprising, really. What I am surprised about is that no one's really done this research or done that much research into this in the past.
As you point out, the problem is that everything is interlinked. And when we talk about diet, we're also influenced by our exercise patterns and by the attitudes that we have with regard to food. And it strikes me, for example, that people who go on a fast or go on a vegan diet or a vegetarian diet, what they probably all have in common is they're trying to improve themselves. They're trying to make their life better. And in my own experience, I've talked about this many times, Michael, I think that when you try to become the best version of yourself, whatever that might be, the universe wants to help you. And so it would be natural, I think, for people who are involved in any form of self-improvement to experience, let us say, more synchronicities in life. And of course, synchronicity, to my way of thinking, is another form of psi.
There's all sorts of different things that could be going on here. And of course, they could all be going on. So a lot of my professional psychics talked about health being important. Some of them talked about these subtle qualities that we mentioned earlier that might be present in meat and dairy that contain the suffering of the animals. Some of them talked about having an effect on mental clarity, both fasting and, a vegetarian vegan diet, saying that both of those practices help them to have more mental clarity. And they all thought that mental clarity was important in Psi as well. So ethics we've mentioned as well. I mean, it's possible that any or all of these things are going on. But I think what I'm focused on at the moment is really seeing whether there's an association, seeing whether there's an empirical association that I can find between these practices and improvements in Psi. What I'm just planning at the moment is my third empirical study, which will be a set of Ganzfeld experiments. So I'm going to be doing some precognition experiments, and it'll be quasi-experimental in that I'll be taking my participants will hopefully be people who are following all sorts of different diets. So people who are vegans, vegetarians, and meat eaters. And then we'll see whether there's any difference in performance in that. Of course, so that's quite exciting. That's my next stage.
Now, I think some of our viewers, I'm going to say roughly 50%, won't know the term that you just used, the Ganzfeld. So let's talk about that for a moment.
The Ganzfeld is reckoned to be is pretty widely used protocol in Psi research, and it's reckoned to be pretty effective at getting really good results. So the idea is that you set up a condition that puts people in a sort of mild altered state of consciousness. It's kind of like a sleepy state of consciousness. And you do this by putting halved ping pong balls over their eyes and a mask, and also by wearing headphones that have white or pink noise. So the idea is that you create this thing of sort of sensory deprivation, if you like, sort of mild sensory deprivation in a sort of darkened room. And this creates what might be called a kind of sensory hunger that some researchers have talked about. And it's more likely to perhaps induce images and so on. So whilst you're in this sort of state, you're lying there in the state and you're just sort of saying whatever's coming into your mind. And there's a researcher sitting next to you who's writing down all the things that you're saying, all the images that are coming into your mind. And you might be doing a remote viewing task, or you might be doing a precognition task. And at the end, you send this whatever images that have been written down, and then an independent judge then says whether these images that you've come up with, whether they match one of the sort of target locations, whether that's a target location that's somewhere distant in space, or maybe it's a target location that hasn't even been selected yet, in which case it's a precognition experiment.
So basically what you plan to do is to compare in an actual laboratory test the psychic functioning of people who have been fasting, people who are vegans, with a normal population.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I'm not going to be doing the fasting. I'm not going to be testing the fasting. I did think about doing that, but that would, I think the best experimental setup for that would be testing people when they're in a fasting condition and when they're not in a fasting condition, which would, of course, mean testing them twice. So it's going to be difficult enough getting enough people to do this anyway, as well as my time in testing them. So instead of that, I'm just going to be testing people following different diets. So whether they're vegan or vegetarian or meat eating or reducing their meat consumption, because then we can just sort of test them once and see whether people who are vegan and vegetarian perform better than meat eaters, basically, or even the other way around, or maybe there'll be no difference. We'll have to see.
My understanding also of the Ganzfeld procedure that you described is that it's essentially a noise reduction procedure, that people who talk about Psi in terms of communication theory like to think about signal-to-noise ratio, and that if you have a lot of mental chatter, background noises, if you're in for example, a casino where there's always a lot of noise and commotion, that would be an environment likely to depress Psi, which is probably very good for the casino owners. But I would think that fasting or even a vegetarian or a vegan diet have the same impact on people. It reduces mental noise.
Yeah, and I mean that's my kind of favorite theory at the moment, the noise reduction model, for all the reasons that you suggest. And I think that that's where health might come in, because as I say, a lot of research suggests that a vegan diet is more healthy than the one that has meat and dairy. And also fasting has been shown to be very healthy as well. So it's also possible that it quietens down the chatter. I mean, certainly if you're fasting, if your body is not involved in digesting food, then it kind of seems to make sense that things get quietened down. Being vegan, vegetarian, if that is a healthier diet, then that would also perhaps quieten down the chatter. And that's certainly what these professional psychics who I interviewed, that's what they said that they experienced when they fast and when they, and from their vegan diet as well. They felt that it helped to kind of steady the noise. It helped their thoughts become more stable and quiet. So yeah, that is kind of my favorite explanatory theory at the moment.
Michael, why do you think this research could be helpful or important for people? How will people gain from your findings?
Well, I think that there's three possible ways that this might benefit. The first is what really motivated me to start. Really was the idea of how can we improve our receptivity to psi, and how can we improve spiritual development. So if it does turn out that diet is important and these practices do support psi and spiritual development, then obviously it's good to have an empirical basis for that. However, there's sort of other reasons that have sort of come up during the research. So there's another one that so Stanislav Grof, who many of your viewers will have heard of, he talked a lot about spiritual emergencies. So this is a situation where people have a sort of sudden spiritual awakening, and sometimes this can be quite disturbing for people and even traumatic for people. And those who are kind of supporting people at having this kind of sudden transition, they often recommend that these people start eating meat and dairy as a way of grounding themselves. But there's not any kind of empirical basis for that as yet. So I think that's an important contribution as well that this research might make. And finally, the other reason that again has come up through the research, Jess Taylor, one of my sort of psychic participants, she pointed me at a study that has been done at the Windbridge Research Institute, where they noticed that a lot of the mediums that they were using for their research into mediumship weren't very well, really. They had quite a high incidence of autoimmune disease. And what Jess is suggesting, she thinks that practicing psi can actually create inflammations and blockages in the body, that having a vegan diet and actually certain supplements like apple cider vinegar and vitamin C, they can help kind of get rid of this inflammation. And so it could actually be that this might be a kind of optimal psychic nutrition for those who practice psi, as a way of kind of looking after their health, really. So that's a sort of another reason that this research may well be helpful.
So it's very interesting. You're suggesting, if I understand your gist, that possibly people who are being disturbed by psychic functioning that they don't want would do well to eat a lot of meat as a way of shutting it down.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what Stanislav Grof recommends. And there's other people, I think, is it Jack Cornfield? There's kind of quite a lot of that stuff in the literature where people suggest it's kind of common practice, if you like, by people who are supporting people going through these spiritual emergencies. But it's kind of just based on anecdote, really. And I guess it works, because otherwise they'd stop recommending it. So it would be interesting to do some studies and see whether that, well, actually, I think the research I'm already doing may well provide a basis for that, an empirical basis for that.
Well, Michael Daw, I'm very excited by your research approach. I'm going to be following it very carefully. When you complete your final study, I'd be very happy to have you back again with me on New Thinking Aloud. I'm sure our viewers will be very interested. So thank you very much for being with me today.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you very much.
And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us.